Like the early philosophers and theologians before us, we are seeking to nourish our souls, discover the truth, and live in the world, but not of it. Welcome to the Magnus podcast, where John Johnson and Larissa Bianco hope to connect contemporary thinkers to conversations from the catacombs in the classical Christian tradition before us.
Ready to go? Let's do it. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Magnus podcast. I'm John Johnson, joined by two exciting guests today, Ryan Hammill and Dr. Pavlos Papadopoulos. Hello, both of you. Ryan, you're a fellow at AMI and the executive director of the Ancient Languages Institute. Let's get the plugs out of the way. Tell us about your institute first, Ancient Languages.
Sure thing. Thanks so much, and really thrilled to be here. Thanks for the invitation, John. Ancient Language Institute, we're an online language school focusing on, you guessed it, ancient languages. We push the envelope a little bit because we also teach Old English, which is more properly medieval, but no one's speaking it natively anymore, so we think it counts. But we're doing active uses of the language, so online classes where we learn to read, speak, listen to, and write in Latin, Ancient Greek, Biblical Hebrew, and Old English. And that's, more or less how I ended up running into Pavlos and all the guys that we started Agogay with.
That's awesome. And Ancient Languages Institute has been a friend of AMI for a long time. Great to have you in our institute as well. How's it going for you as far as students? Obviously, you guys are part of a huge movement that we're a part of also. Isn't it a beautiful thing to see?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it feels like a renaissance. And you can't have a renaissance without a dark age. So there's a lot of bad things happening in the education world, but I think that has opened up space for places like Magnus, places like ALI to really grow and thrive. And so, yeah, we've just been overwhelmed with gratitude by how many people are interested in joining us and learning to speak ancient languages.
Amen. What's the URL for people to find Ancient Languages Institute?
ancientlanguage.org.
ancientlanguage.org. Awesome. And Pavlos Papadopoulos, Senior Fellow at AMI, Professor at Wyoming Catholic College, and future Governor of Wyoming, God willing, one of these days.
No way.
Come on.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Pavlos.
Good to be back. Thanks so much, John. It's really good to be back on your show. I guess in line with the topic of this episode, I would be okay perhaps with being the teacher of princes, but I'm not really interested in being a prince myself. So no thank you to the governorship. Though I'm
so true. Very hard to be both. Tell us what's going on at Wyoming Catholic. Obviously, one of the best places in the world to get an undergraduate education. So beautiful, a place that's captured my heart, and one of the few places I'd be willing to send my own kids one of these days when they come of age. How's it going out there?
It's great. We are, as you know, we're located out in Lander, Wyoming, in the foothills of the Wind River Mountains. We are in something like our 15th year or a little bit more than that of existence. So we're part of this wonderful renaissance, revival, renewal, recreation of classical liberal arts education. We, of course, are Catholic, and we are just, I'm really happy to be here, and I intend to stay here until they kick me out or until someone else shuts us down. But we're doing great. Wonderful community of students and faculty who I can really call my friends, and we're just plugging along out here.
Amen. That's wyomingcatholic.edu, if I remember correctly. Awesome. Mm-hmm. I'm taping this down here in Napa at the Napa Institute, getting to party a little bit with your president, Kyle Washut, good friend of mine.
Yep.
I think you guys are going to be doing some really, really good things, even bigger things really, really soon. So
I think so as well. And Kyle, President Washut, he's been with our college since before it existed. He was washing dishes for the institution that later became Wyoming Catholic when he was a teenager, and he's all the way bought in. He understands our mission and he's passionate about it. I think he's going to be and continue to be a great advocate for our education.
Homegrown to the bone. That's amazing. Right. Very good. So this is one of my favorite kinds of episodes to record because it is Three Beers with John Johnson, where we actually drink three beers as we discuss some profound topic. It's like that show Pints with Aquinas, but we're actually engaging with real Aquinas. Just
Well,
kidding.
What do
Shots
you all
fired.
have? You guys
I have
beers.
I have a Lagunitas Daytime, which I bought from the hotel lobby.
Very good.
So cheers. Thank you guys for joining us today.
Cheers.
Yeah, I guess I'll need to open mine up.
Let's hear it.
This is local beer. So I'm in Eugene, Oregon, which is, Pacific Northwest. We kind of cursed the rest of America and made you all drink IPAs all the time. But this is not an IPA. This is Ale Song. It's a local brewery. Very masculine beer called Whiskers on Kittens.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, IPAs, they went a little too far. I kind of liked them before they were cool.
Yeah, I've definitely overdosed on them.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I want to talk to you guys about agoge. Agoge? Agoge? Agog? Agog?
It's all good. Yeah.
Come on.
All of the above.
Ryan, you're the ancient language expert.
Well,
You say agoge?
I'll just say this. When people come to us at ALI asking about Greek pronunciation, there's just blood in the streets on how to pronounce ancient Greek correctly. There's a bajillion pronunciation schemes. So I'm very ecumenical about how to pronounce Greek stuff. So agoge, whatever.
I tend to look down on humans who say pedagogy instead of pedagogy. So, but you're more tolerant than I am. So, this is beautiful. You guys launched so Ryan, Pavlos, and a few other friends of ours launched this website, agogeclassical.org, and you launched with a manifesto on the relationship between education and politics. And so why don't you guys give our audience an elevator pitch of your manifesto?
Sure. So we titled it Education is Always Political. And we say that by political, we mean something broader and deeper than partisan politics, but that education is classically understood as part of a political project, and that politics is also classically understood as educative, as the law is a teacher, the regime is a teacher in some way. And what we're trying to do is really plant a flag for the classical movement to rally to. Because in our experience with the classical education movement, and we're teachers and scholars, some of us have taught at the K-12 level, others of us are at the college level or doing something else like Ryan is with the Ancient Language Institute, which is sort of para-academic educational initiative. We've noticed a kind of drift in the classical education movement, and we're all strong friends of classical education and excited to be part of its renewal. But we've seen a lot of a trend towards an accommodation with progressivism, left ideology, or even just sort of garden variety American liberal thought. And we'd like to help people wake up, and we'd also like to help clarify the terms of the debate and the terms of the classical education movement by pointing out that the classics themselves, the classical authors, understood that man is naturally political, that education is always going to be a political endeavor of some kind, and to do so in a way that shows our fellow teachers and students and so on that there's an alternative to just sticking your head in the sand like an ostrich, or being totally engaged in current events and current politics in a kind of activist way. So what we're trying to point out is that you can't help but be a political animal, and your school, your educational endeavor can't help but be implicated in and contribute in one way or another to the formation of citizens, and thus the formation or deformation of our political regime.
Okay, you don't have to name names, though you're always welcome to, but could you characterize the drift a little bit more that you are fighting against? Just so we're clear on where are we going wrong here?
Yeah, so a pretty mild and not explicitly political version of it is just to advocate for classical education in the most boring way, which is to say that if you read great books, if you study Latin, if you work hard in school, you'll develop critical thinking skills better than your normal public school education. And then you'll score better in the SAT and go to an Ivy League school or something because of that. Thank you, classical education, for sort of helping us achieve those conventional goods of modern education better. That's the most apolitical version of it, or not explicitly political version. Another version, more expressly political, is to say, look, classical education, we love classical education. We love the great books. We love the tradition, but we're uncomfortable with it because we know that this is the educational product of a civilization that conquered the world and committed all kinds of injustices in so doing, and that is implicated in racism and sexism and all kinds of other bad isms. And so what we'd like to do is maintain the ethos or structure of classical ed, but expand the canon. And so this is oftentimes done with the best of intentions, I think, saying, look, we can read Homer and we can read Plato and we could read Dante, and we should also find and insert into the canon authors who are either neglected within this tradition, often because of their sex, because they're female authors, or from outside that tradition to sort of spice things up with something outside of the Western tradition, but it's still going to be classical. And so that's a somewhat more politically tinged, and you really saw this starting to take off in a strong way about 4 years ago in 2020 for obvious reasons. I will say that another iteration of this, which is maybe somewhere in between the two that I've just articulated, is the idea that classical education is wonderful because it is and can be totally apolitical. We can make saints, not citizens, right? We can sort of lead people out of the cave into the light, which means leaving behind all of the mundane concerns and all of the ugliness of partisan politics and all the distortions that inevitably occur in there. And so classical education can be a mode of rescuing young people, in this case, young Americans, from all that is degraded and degrading about contemporary American culture and so on. And it's really about just transcending the particular, being sort of sucked up into the universal. If you're a Christian classical educator, this argument would say, we're preparing you for heaven, which is where your true home is. You're a citizen of the heavenly city and not this earthly city. And so that's another mode of sort of de-emphasizing politics and its, I think, inevitable role in our educational endeavors, which I think often just opens them up and allows them to be co-opted by more explicitly ideological takeover.
Okay, good. So let's synthesize those three. The first being an over-instrumentalization of these liberal arts, that it's like, okay, you can be a great critical thinker, which is kind of antithetical to the liberal arts themselves. The second would be apoliticize. It's the beer already.
Politicization.
Politicization. There we go.
Depoliticization.
Depoliticization.
Yeah. Quietism, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then the third would be a sort of, I don't know, over Benedict optioning of this, like they're sort of remove you from the world. I'm confused about the difference between the last two, I guess. Like,
I guess I would say if we could have the critical thinking version, the withdrawal from politics, quietistic version, and then the one that I actually mentioned in the middle would be the diversification of the canon.
Oh, that's right. The de-Westernization of the canon.
Yes, and we're still going to be classical, and it's going to be for everyone, because the great books are, I can read Plato and I exist in a very different context from him. So of course people from other cultures can read him. No one in classical education would deny that. But then they go further and say, and so why don't we expand the canon, and why don't we find the greatest authors who are neglected or from different cultures and multiculturalize classical education?
Okay, so I have a pretty good idea. We won't name names, but I have a pretty good idea who's doing the instrumentalization. I have a pretty good idea of who's doing the de-Westernization. Why don't we read Maya Angelou and Rumi? That should be a part of the canon too. I actually don't have a clear idea of who's doing the quietistic move. I mean, I totally see where it could pop up in certain places, but
I actually think that's probably the one you're going to encounter the most. not necessarily in essays or
Mhm.
podcasts, but like on the ground in schools, talking to parents and teachers.
Yeah.
In part because of the nature of the classical education movement. I mean, the phrase classical education can mean a lot of different things. But here in the US, we're really in the middle of this concerted movement that if I think the best thing that's been written about it in terms of the kind of history and background is fellow co-founder, Aggregate co-founder Micah Meadowcroft in National Affairs. It's, I think, the Aristocracy of Anyone. Is that what it's called, Pavlos? Yeah. He wrote this long history uncovering kind of the origins of this movement. And so Doug Wilson is one of the big names, and he started Logos School in Moscow, Idaho, but there's a few others. Anyways, much of the appeal for the classical education movement was similar, at least in the beginning, to homeschooling.
Yep.
These schools and teachers' unions are totally in bed with leftist politics. We don't want that for our kids. We need to do something different. That wasn't the only thing, but that was a big part of it. And so when you're reacting against the politicization of education and schools being little ideological culture warrior factories, then it makes sense that you're like, okay, we're not going to do that. We're going to do the opposite. We just want to focus on excellence. We're going to become really good at math. We're going to become really good at reading long, hard books. We're going to learn discipline and manners. And we're going to succeed. And so this is a kind of error that makes a lot of sense. It's very defensible and psychologically understandable, and I think very popular, even among people who are in the movement.
You're right. And now I see it clearly. So to the extent that there's a reaction against what's going on out there and you want to insulate and pull your kids in and just not be them and not be susceptible to what they're sharing, then you become overly insulated and quietistic, to use your word.
And yeah, and I mean, to credit, so I named Doug Wilson as one of the kind of origin points of this movement. You know, part of the origin story for Logos and what he's been up to in Moscow is some of what I talked about, but he hasn't never gone down this path. But there's plenty of people who have. So I just want to be clear. I'm not criticizing him or anything. Just that it's a very understandable. I mean, it's like, how do you get normie parents in the suburbs to send their kid to a classical school? What the heck is a classical school? Oh, well, this is a place where, kids are going to learn cursive. We stopped doing cursive in the 70s. We're doing cursive now again. And it's like, oh yeah, I can get on board with cursive. And
that's also where the instrumentalization comes in, because guys like me, guys like Jeremy Tate are out there, and they're like, this is actually the best way to get an awesome job. This is actually the best way to get hired. This is actually really, really useful. In doing so, we tend to betray the liberal arts themselves by turning them into this functional thing, which they're not. They're ends in themselves, but it is a hard thing. Like, I'm probably guilty of the instrumentalization, at least as an impresario, but it's hard not to do that, right? Because you got to sell it to these, either the Catholic moms or the Earth moms in California. There's a lot of strange bedfellows between both of those. They're just like, I don't want that. It's like, well, here's an alternative for you. How do you do that? It's kind of a perennial struggle of mine, but how do you do that without over instrumentalizing the liberal arts?
Well, just to note, another reason for that temptation that we're pointing to is to avoid a different kind of instrumentalization, which is precisely the instrumentalization that maybe our agoge position comes closest to, which is not that this is going to help you get a job or something like that, but that this is going to make you a good citizen. That this form of education, and just to be perfectly frank, if you go back and sort of read the arc of classics from Greece onwards, this is a perennial tension. right? And it's manifested in one way in Plato, and it's manifested in another way in Christianity and Scripture and in the Christian tradition, between the different cities to which we belong, or the fact that we are here in the cave in Athens, but we're also trying to ascend it. And so there's a wonderful passage early in Christopher Dawson's great book on the crisis of Western education, where he points out that the liberal arts were originally civic arts, that they began in the generations before Plato and Socrates. They began as the arts that you would want to equip young citizens with so that they could discharge their citizenly duty. And so speaking persuasively, and the military arts really are the original liberal arts, which are originally civic arts. And it's only with the development of philosophy in, and I would say from that context of the Greek polis, that you have a kind of philosophical anthropology that comes and helps elevate the liberal arts to be not only about preparing young men to be citizens once they're of the proper age, to be caring for the common good of Athens or Sparta or wherever they're from, or Rome, but instead to be doing that and yet also to be elevating them higher and beyond that. And so in a certain way, we might be open to that charge, that accusation that we are trying to tear down some of the elevation that is part of the Western tradition of ascending from mere particularity and mere circumstance to something transcendent and higher. And I guess what I would say in response to that is that this is a balancing act, and we're planted here in our particular time and place, and we're supposed to rise up to something beyond all of that. But to bring in another source, the dream of Scipio is something that always sticks with me on this topic. Cicero's dream of Scipio at the end of his De Republica, where the character Scipio has a vision and is transported into the heavens and looks back down at the earth and sees how small and petty the concerns of Rome and its wars with its neighbors are in light of the whole order of the cosmos. And he's tempted to just abandon his duty to his city while they're besieging Carthage, in favor of just ascending to the heavens. And he is instructed by his ancestor in the middle of this vision that the way you ascend up to here to the realm of the gods is to serve your country well, is to serve your fatherland on earth well. And in fact, that I think must be the case for us Christians, that Scripture teaches us that God establishes authorities on earth, and God has in some way made the nations, and he expects us to exercise charity towards our neighbors and our co-citizens as well as our family. And it's through that love and service to the people around us that we are able to love Christ, who plays in 10,000 places, and able to sort of prepare ourselves for something transcendent. All of which is to say there is a kind of tension to be managed here. And we may be erring more on the political side because we feel that too many of our classical educators have erred so far on the transcendent or the apolitical side of this.
Okay, excellent Hopkins shout out there. That was beautiful. Before you go, Ryan, can you guys please break down this chicken or the egg thing? Because I heard you say earlier that the law is fundamentally educative, but we would tend to think that it's education that informs the law. Are those both true? Which comes first? And then, sorry, Ryan, you go ahead with whatever you want to.
I think those are both true. I mean, this is the same confusion in Plato's Republic about the city being an image of the soul and the soul being an image of the city, and each regime in the city reflecting the regime or order within the soul, and vice versa. There is a give and take here. And I'll just say, when the ancient Spartans looked to their lawgiver Lycurgus, or when the Romans looked to their lawgiver and founder Romulus, and they divinize him, this is for very understandable reasons, because these are examples of men who so profoundly imprint the order of their own soul on their community that they seem to be breaking out of this sort of cyclical relationship between city and individual and individuals and city. Someone who so clearly asserts himself and his legislative power in order to give the city a new regime must be a god. And we could say that we receive the divine law and we receive the eternal law through the natural law from God. And there's a way in which we have to posit some divine being standing outside of ourselves and our order who has given us these inclinations that we feel in the natural law. And so all of which to say, yeah, there is a kind of cyclical relationship of the character of the people in your city is going to create and inform the regime, the character of the city. And the way you educate your citizens and your princes or your presidents is going to inform that, but they're always already in a political context. We don't start with some state of nature and a blank slate and then create some order just due to how we're negotiating with our co-contractarians. We're always already in a political environment. We always already are bearing on our soul and our heart and in our minds certain patterns of thought due to our regime. And those are themselves a product of human thought and agency and ultimately divine and natural patterns that preceded us.
Is that a shot against Rousseau you just made there?
Among others, yeah. Certainly, yeah.
Okay, how specifically do you see those currents bubbling up into the problems that we have today?
I think so. The way I would recognize that today is that those who would like to practice a non-political version of education have fallen for the myth of neutrality, that it's possible to have a sort of neutral public square, or that it's possible to have neutral institutions that don't take a strong stand on fundamental human and moral and ultimately religious questions, and who think that they can offer something that does not necessarily come in conflict with the regime. They can offer something in their schools. And that's only, I think, that's only thinkable, that's only intelligible if you assume that the regime, the larger regime out there, is operating according to the myth of liberal neutrality, which is to say, we're not taking a stand on what the best way of life is. We're not taking a stand on truth. We're just kind of policing the boundaries between different communities and different individuals to make sure they don't step on each other's toes. But we, the whole regime, are not imposing anything on anyone or inclining anyone in any direction. I think if that could actually be the case, which it can't, then we could have a sort of neutral public square, and we could have neutral institutions that were purely tolerant without any inclination one direction or another. I just don't think that's true.
No, we're watching the establishments built on that idea fail around us now in at rapid pace. So, okay. So Ryan, tell us more. What is education and what's its relationship to the law and vice versa?
Sure. Yeah. I just want to go back to this kind of idea of instrumentalizing, because, yeah, on the one hand, it's an error, and ancient languages too. Oh, why should we study Latin? Oh, well, it's actually really good for your brain. It's this kind of complex ordered system, and so if you learn it, you're going to be really good at the SAT or the LSAT or coding, and
which is all true. It's all true.
Yeah,
right?
I'm not even disagreeing. It's just this is kind of the rhetoric, and so you can apply the same thing to classical ed. It's going to make you productive. And so, yeah, I guess our objection isn't to instrumentalizing per se. I mean, instrumentalizing, it's kind of a dirty word, but even when we're making the case for the kind of instrumental use of classical education for forming a good regime, for making responsible citizens, for making patriotic, courageous men, part of that's going to be economic too. Are you going to have a healthy country when you have a bunch of useless people who can't produce anything, who can't look after anything, who aren't responsible, who are lazy? Like, no, part of having a healthy country and having good citizens is having productive, successful people. So there's no problem per se with kind of classical education being good for helping people get a good job. If classical education is actually awesome, then we kind of should expect that it'll do that. And you should also expect that it will produce good citizens. But then there's also more, because some people want to avoid the political task of education by just doing the kind of economic instrumentalization. And some people want to avoid the political task of education by just doing the kind of contemplative philosophic thing. But education is more than just philosophy. You don't get a classroom full of fifth graders and it's like, time to do metaphysics. This would be a very bad idea. But there is a contemplative task that's enjoyable, and most importantly, reveals the truth to people. I mean, all this stuff is important. So we're not saying any of that is bad, just that it's really bad if you take the heart, if you take the chest, you take the thumos out of education. It's like the men without chests in Abolition of Man. That's kind of what has happened to education, is like all of this civic virtue, all of this courage, all of this spiritedness people want to take out, I think because they're scared of it. Because if you get a bunch of thumotic people who are really patriotic and love the truth, like, sounds a little risky. And people don't want to go there. And so what we're saying is we need the chest. We need that.
And who maybe initiated that line of thinking in excising the thumotic strain from education, as I see it, that's Thomas Hobbes. He's pretty explicit in the Leviathan that it's a huge threat to political order to have all these young men reading the classics. If they read Plutarch, if they read Cicero, if they read Livy, then they're going to get all these inflated notions about the proper liberty of their fatherland, the rights of citizens. And on Hobbes's reading, they're going to overinflate the appeal of liberty, and then they're going to be bad subjects of the absolute monarch, the Leviathan, whom Hobbes is sort of proposing as the one solution to all political problems. And it's precisely by going back and reading those tales of great men and women, in Livy, think about Lucretia and Virgilia and others, who are daring in pursuing liberty and securing the customs of their country and standing up to tyrants. It's precisely by doing that and giving enough attention to those classical figures and heroes and citizens that classical education poses a threat to our modern regime. It's trying to make sure that we have men with chests. It's trying to make sure that citizens are spirited, or at least that is an effect of going back and actually reading the classics without distorting them and domesticating them in the way that our 21st century liberal norms might want us to. It's a threat. It really threatens to make students and then citizens spirited, and that's what a tyrant or a tyrannical or a managerial administrative regime wants to avoid. It wants people to be lazy and fat and a little bit poor, but still getting by and content with their Netflix and their pornography and their entertainment, so that they don't stand up and stand up for political liberty and their constitution and so on.
Well, what makes a thumotic man thumotic, isn't it precisely in his willingness to give his life and die for something greater than him? It's honor. It's a love of honor, which means that the man is willing to suffer pain for something beautiful and ultimately die. It's like the spirit of courage. It's really interesting. You mentioned Hobbes, because he was like terrified of death, wasn't he? I mean, he lived to be pretty old, but he lived scared of dying, and he finally died. An
extremely long life, and the centerpiece of his political philosophy, it all rests on convincing everyone that the worst thing in the world is violent death.
That's right.
And which means, and it's very clear about, he wants to crush the kind of person that he calls vainglorious, and Aristotle might just call great souled or courageous.
That's right.
You need to persuade people, and he has all kinds of ways of doing this in Leviathan, that all of those great causes that you are standing up for are mistaken or not actually true or mythical or something like that based on superstitions. so that you can get enough people in your society who are going to be compliant with just about anything, so long as the sovereign is promising them security from violent death. And we saw that in spades during COVID time, that we've gone very far in this direction, that people will be compliant to give up their fundamental liberties of speech, of religious worship, of community, if they are persuaded that to do so is going to help them survive for longer.
Right. Versus, I guess classically thumotic man like Achilles, he's willing to burn the whole house down for the sense of honor, right? He's willing to pick a fight. He's willing to die. He's willing to make others die. But because he has a cause greater than himself. And I guess there is some point of moderation that we would find the mean is beautiful, but it's true that we need more thumos in the classroom. I would especially point out something everybody can relate to is the over feminization of teaching, right? Like how many grade schoolers even get a male teacher? I think this is kind of in our bones from a very young age, that education is just something very feminine and orderly and safe. And we're doing our kids a disservice. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that, we're kind of eggheads theory people who like reading and writing essays, but a lot of the challenges facing classical education are very practical. And one of these is money.
Yep.
And that relates directly to what you're talking about, because if you have mostly conservative, mostly traditional people involved in this movement, what they're going to want are a male breadwinner and a mom at home. And if you are paying a pittance at your classical school, you are not going to make that possible for your teachers. And so you're going to have the same exact problem that you see in public schools that you're talking about. And in fact, the people who want to have a male breadwinner are going to go to the public schools and teach because they can get more money and benefits.
That is sadly true. What is the remedy to that? Because it's a huge dilemma. It's, Chesterton Academy is a great example of it. They do an awesome job, but they pay their teachers nothing. So they have a hard time attracting long-lasting head of household teachers, like precisely the kind of person we're describing here. Is anybody doing this really? Has anybody figured this out? Because it's kind of a dilemma that nobody seems to have figured out yet.
I mean, one thing is school choice. So, I mean, I'm on the left coast. We actually have a petition campaign in Oregon right now to get school choice on the ballot so that tax money can follow you to whatever school you want to go to. I don't know a ton about this issue, but I was in Arkansas not too long ago, earlier this year, and from the pulpit, the pastor, he's advertising like the church school enrollment is open. He says, well, because Governor Huckabee Sanders' school choice bill passed, 90% of tuition is covered by the state. So there's really no reason not to enroll your kid. And I'm just thinking to myself, 90% of tuition is covered. You're paying 10% of tuition to go to private school because here in Oregon, insane property taxes now follow you and your kids wherever you choose to go. I think if classical schools can get that money, then they need to be extremely aggressive about raising wages for teachers, and that would go a long ways. So there should be really concerted efforts to get school choice on the ballot in every state, or even pushing it at the federal level if depending on how things go in November.
I'll just add on that this isn't too much of a detailed comment on the policy or how you run your school question, but administrative bloat is not just an efficiency or economic problem. It is a kind of function of what John referred to as over-feminization. So many of these administrative positions are about having someone in place that complaints can go to and then be worked out by the higher authority who's going to sort of mediate these disputes between people, instead of having employees talk more directly to each other or students talk more directly to each other. And so going along with the imperative raising teacher salaries so that you attract and keep good talent and in some cases, sole breadwinners and so on. One of the ways to do that is to keep down the administrative costs as much as possible. That's not just a budget saving measure. I would say that's a political regime type measure, because we see reproduced in all of our institutions, in our corporations, in our smaller companies, in our schools, in our colleges and universities. We see reproduced this administrative bloat, which is mirroring the creation of the administrative state and this giant paternalistic government at the federal level. These things are actually reflections of one another, and in both cases, there's a kind of cutting out of the chest or of the thumos, which is to say the self-assertiveness of people within a community to be able to assert their claims and negotiate with one another and stand up for themselves or take care of themselves and those around them. And there's a kind of evacuation of that own initiative on the parts of the members of a community, and allowing some higher bureaucrat in your organization, whether that's governmental or educational, to take care of all these problems and mediate these disputes. All of these things are intertwined, I think.
Absolutely. I got a great friend, Scott, who teaches at a public high school, and he's teaching in a public school because he makes, like you said, Ryan, a little bit more money than he can make anywhere else. But every day is war for this guy because he's surrounded by this bureaucratic nanny mentality that, it's not amicable to a head of household teaching either. So something's got to give. I mean, what do you think about starting with the rich, in the sense that you make like these regional boarding schools where you charge 30 grand a year for tuition, then slowly build endowments? It's like trickle down education. Like you build these places that can serve the people really excellently who can afford it. And then as you become more and more sustainable, allow anybody locally into these places. I mean, I'm just trying to think out loud about the way to really skin this cat, but it doesn't seem like an easy problem to solve.
Yeah, if you want to charge top dollar, you're gonna have to charge a lot more than $30,000 even for K through 12.
Yeah, maybe.
I've seen some insane numbers. Yeah, I mean, I'll say that classical ed has been an amazing movement of normal American Christians for the large part, and they have done a lot with very little. And it's really impressive. So, I mean, they need to keep building on their success. There's no sense in which they should pull back or anything. But you are starting to see, and this is really interesting, something that started as a movement just in terms of demographics, with a lot of just kind of normal people starting to appear in elite circles.
Yes.
So it's this weird thing. Like, I assume we all on this call have young kids, and so you're always periodically thinking about baby names. And so classic baby name thing, wealthy people in cities start using a name, and it's kind of out there and different, and then it filters down to normal people, and then, Liam, which 10 years ago was like, Liam, oh, interesting. Now everybody's named Liam.
Yeah.
But classical education has gone the other direction. It's like, these people in the Polis of Idaho start this classical school, and now all of a sudden there's tech people in San Francisco and Seattle who are like, conservative Catholics or evangelicals, like, oh, I think classical ed might be the way to go for our children. And so it's kind of a heartland to the coasts movement, which is really fascinating to me. And yeah, I mean, the possibilities that opens up are really big. Especially, you also have big charter networks too, Hillsdale, Great Hearts, etc., that do have state money coming into them that can make things easier. But then that raises new challenges. How classical can you be if you're constrained by being a government school, because charters still basically are.
Yep.
If you can't catechize people into true religion, you can still do a lot, but you can't tell people, Jesus literally rose from the dead. We all need to believe that. That's really important. You really can't do that in a charter school. So how classical can it be? And I think there's a lot of different answers to this question. People have kind of started to talk about it, but that's another conversation, kind of like whether education is political. That's another conversation that needs to happen, because you're starting to see fault lines open up over that one too.
Yeah, that's true. And definitely out here in California, you have the tech, quote unquote, elites who send their kids to classical schools very intentionally because they know exactly what their own products are attempting to do to humanity. And so they don't let their kids anywhere near a computer or an iPad.
Right.
And they're wise to do so. So it's true. They're like I said, there's strange bedfellows. California's homeschool scene is just on fire right now in a great way because of these, earth moms, as I like to call them, and the organic moms who have sort of teamed up with the trad Catholics to make for pretty fertile homeschool conditions and actually safe. Like there's a lot of charter school money, homeschool money, and it bears good fruit, I think. So that is good. And I don't want to black pill anybody. Like, this movement is doing great. It's on the right track. The trajectory is tremendous. Like we are much better than we were when I was a kid. That's for sure. So education and politics, what's a victory look like for Agoge? What are you guys trying to do? You just trying to get the word out? Are you trying to start a movement, trying to start a pitchfork mob? Like what does victory look like for you guys?
Pavlos, I really liked what you said. I haven't used this language because people have asked me this question about Agoge multiple times, and so I kind of give them this winding answer. But you said planting a flag. So we're not, we're not a school, we're not a curriculum company. Really, we're a signal chat that made a website and wrote a bunch of stuff and then started talking to people about it. But I like this idea of planting a flag. We want to steer discourse and get people talking and thinking about, and hopefully convinced of our position. But that's still pretty abstract. Pavlos, do you have a better kind of take on what victory would look like?
Well, to try to translate it for you left coasters, we're trying to raise consciousness, right? We're sort of
thank you. That helps. Yeah.
Which is to say, to point out some things that might not be that ordinary parents, teachers, school administrators who don't spend their days thinking about political philosophy, and then also happen to be involved in classical education, who don't spend their days sort of thinking with these categories of regime and law as not just the fences around sovereign individuals, but as something that's actually informing a whole community and teaching people about right and wrong. Just to point out to ordinary Americans engaged in one way or another in this movement, that there are political questions at stake in education, that there are different perspectives for thinking about questions that sometimes are very nitty-gritty curricular questions about what kinds of authors or what kinds of policies ought to be governing discipline in your schools or something like that. That there is a whole nother angle that's a little bit outside of, or in some cases very outside of, the dominant framework for thinking about culture and society and politics in 21st century America. And what we're really trying to do, each in our own way, we're not speaking with one single voice on every issue, the members of Agoge and everyone who's contributed to it. But we're trying to bring to bear, broadly speaking, what the classics would actually say about classical education, and not just about curriculum, although that's important, but what the classical tradition would say to us about the situation of the classical education movement in contemporary America. We really believe that Homer and Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and all of these guys are worth reading for their own sake, for whatever can be learned from reading their dialogues, their poems, their philosophical treatises. But we also believe that, and all of that is enriching and enlightening, but all of that is also informative of how you can actually analyze a situation that's in front of you. And that includes something like a subculture working against the grain of the political spirit of the times and the kind of regime that we have, a sort of insurgent or grassroots movement of parents and communities and local schools trying to do education differently, and frankly being dragged by the inertia of all of the assumptions of modern liberalism that we all have with us to some degree. And so what we would like to do is help further classicize the classical ed movement, to say this isn't just old content in the sort of progressive modern educational system. And it's also not just a few classical pedagogical methods to displace modern educational methods. There's a whole perspective on what a human being is, and thus a whole perspective on what politics is, and the place of education and politics that the classics have, that they can teach us, and that we should think about as a lens through which to view our own situation of the classical ed movement and education in America.
Yeah, it's almost like building an immune system for the movement, because it's a kind of heartland to coasts movement. There's sometimes a bit of an inferiority complex, this is, I like this school for our kids, it's good, but this isn't what people with PhDs, this isn't what they do for their kids who live in New York City. And I read an article in the Washington Post about how classical ed might be racist. Oh no, what are we gonna do? This is part of the reason people within the movement have said, oh, we need to diversify the canon because of these accusations. And it's really an inferiority complex, because it's this homegrown thing. So we must be peasants.
Right.
No, you almost uniquely in the United States of America are championing Plutarch. Nobody even knows who Plutarch is anymore. And you are reading Plutarch to your children. Like, there's no sense in which you should have an inferiority complex. So we need to build a little bit of an immune system against these threats. Yeah, from outside, but really from inside the movement. And
one more mark of progress that we've already seen at Agoge, and that I'm happy to see, I will be happy to see more of, and I invite your listeners to if they're interested. We've had people coming to our website and then reaching out to us about to ask about the situation of their own school. How does this apply to this thing that's happening at my school? What can I read? We have a list of essays that the members of Agoge have written, and then also recommended essays and books that other people have written that touch on this complex of topics. And so being a kind of a flag planted in the ground, a rallying point, and a place for conversation, and a place where something like informal consulting. We're not a consulting company, and we're not trying to do that right now, but to be able to get in touch with other classical educators who realize that something's off and they might not have put their finger on it, and then hopefully we're helping them do that. And we're all writing about this and thinking about this pretty frequently, and we read like-minded people or just other people who are touching on the same topic. And so just being a place, a kind of library of resources for thinking through these issues, we're very happy that people have been reaching out to us.
Yeah, that's what's most exciting to me, is just as an aggregator for awesome ideas in the blogosphere put together in one place. It's like sort of like a Drudge Report for classical education. It's awesome. I love it. I noticed you guys teamed up with my buddy Colin Redimer, who is a potential Catholic, as I like to call him, a Protestant. He would like to call himself. Yeah. But he has, in his little opening manifesto, he's got this line about the tradition is ultimately Bible based, and I'm probably misquoting him, but would we have to draw a distinction between the Bible basis and the Christ basis? And I think that's sort of a Protestant misstep that might be detrimental to our ultimate goals. And I wish Colin were here so I could pick that fight to his face. But
as a longtime friend of Colin, I'm happy to defend him against accusations of papalatry.
Please, yes.
Yeah. Wait, so what the Protestant misstep is Christ versus Bible.
Bible versus Christ.
Yeah, I would put it
Yeah.
Pavlos's way. Yeah. Mhm.
Well, I mean, I think I don't even think this is a Protestant Catholic thing. In his kind of mini essay that went along with our opening Education is Always Political statement, he's talking about education, curriculum, books. And so what book has been
Yep. The Bible.
in every
Good.
American home,
Great
every
answer.
American school?
Great
Yeah.
answer. Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
That's good. That's good.
And
When
I would-
when I think of the basis of this tradition, it's Christ, the person, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, the eternal Logos, who's living and breathing and obviously inspires and forms the scriptures. And I think when somebody says to a Catholic, the Word of God, we think of a person. When somebody says a Protestant, the Word of God, they think of a book. And there is a difference, right? And one can sort of be the living basis and conduit of an organic tradition. The other, it's hard to make that case.
I'll just note that I wish the classical education was in the position where they were arguing about the primacy of the Bible or the primacy of sort of Christ the person. Or I think what the position that the classical ed movement is in is first that kind of inferiority complex towards elite secular education that Ryan had described. Secondly, within classical ed, there's the question of whether classical ed ought to be, or in some people's telling, even can be Christian, which is absurd. But if you read the
Yes.
Prestige Press, if you read the Atlantic coverage of classical ed, New York Times, Washington Post, I mean, all of these places have started to actually notice this thing, which in a certain way is great and a sign of its spread and success. But there are advocates out there who don't merely say it's an open question about the place of should the Bible be one of many books, but who actually say, of course, it can't be a religious education because that's mere indoctrination and it's not liberal education, it's not classical. I mean, it's just absurd that the classical tradition obviously comes into synthesis with Christianity, and speaking as a Christian, we can look back at Greece and Rome and other civilizations as providentially preparing for the incarnation and so on. But gosh, I wish we were in a position where we could have the debate in the way that you just articulated. I'll just add that another way of thinking about this is just the importance of the liturgy, of worship, of mass, of prayer at a properly Christian, whether it's Protestant or Catholic classical school. I mean, yes, that should be understood as an integral part of the education. Of course, worshiping God in a corporate body is part of formation and education. And gosh, where do I hear the Psalms most often? It's when I attend the Divine Liturgy at our Byzantine Catholic chapel. It's not because, to my shame, maybe I'm just reading the Psalms out loud to my family at home. Maybe I should do more of that. But there's another place where I encounter the Word of God in another sense, is just through chanting it.
Well said. You've defended your friend and mine well. Colin would be proud of you. And I'm sold, right? That I'm sorry to nitpick, but that was beautifully done. I want to switch gears and talk about modern politics. We are in a mess. We are in a huge mess. It's obviously a problem of education. It's a problem of other things too, but it's particularly strange as of late. There are so many political phenomena. Pavlos, I want to get your take on this especially, but there's so many things that I just can't explain, especially around this guy, Donald Trump. Where do you think we go from here? You referenced earlier I think the Spartan, I can't remember who it was, but the strong man that's basically deified.
Mm-hmm.
Are we on a fast track to that sort of thing happening? Where do we go from here politically, especially as it relates to education, but just the overall policy seems to be falling off a cliff pretty fast in strange ways. I just love your take on that.
Sure. I think we're so far from recognizing the proper role of persons, of individual leaders, and of statesmen in politics that the imagery of Trump getting shot and holding up his fist and chanting "fight" and the accusation, especially from the left, but also from some on the right, against Trump and against his supporters for the last 8 years or so now, that this is a cult of personality, that this is the return of Caesarism or something like that. I just think we're so far from the proper recognition of the importance of actual individual persons that individual leaders can play in politics, like the normal, sober role for that, that all of this is a kind of overreaction. Look, we have, in the course, especially of the last 120 years, the American regime has been largely, not completely, but largely transformed from a republic into an administrative state, in which there is a class of largely unaccountable bureaucratic managers who run the country and its most important functions. A result of which is that there's never any kind of accountability. You just have the blob, you just have the system, and you can always feed every criticism and every failing into the system and say there's a process that we're going through to try to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Whether this is the lapses in security at that rally in Pennsylvania, or the loss of two major wars fought by the United States in the last 25 years that no one, in terms of their job or their reputation within or outside of government, has paid for. The journalists who advocated for our invasion of Iraq and the generals who prosecuted that war and the other war. I mean, they lost a war pretty egregiously, and they haven't paid for it with their reputation or their jobs. And so this is a function of the unaccountability of a deeply depersonalized system of governance that we have largely entered, not entirely. And so
isn't that why we love Trump so much? Is that he's the guy who we are betting is most likely to be able to destroy that blob.
He's a wrecking ball. That's right. And he's a person. And so again, love him or hate him, he is a person with distinctive qualities who gives you the sense that he's going to do certain things, and he's going to reward you for something, and he's going to punish enemies and so on. You get the sense that he is an agent and an independent agent, again, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. In contrast, I mean, just look at the Republican Party 10 years ago, or the Democratic Party right now. What we just saw was the very rapid and pretty smooth swapping out of one figurehead for another. Joe Biden is discovered to be less favorable for the election, and who swaps him out? I'm not positing a conspiracy in any kind of tinfoil hat way, but a conspiracy in the precise sense of there's a lot of people conspiring, breathing together. There's a kind of a swarm of concerned donors and activists and stakeholders and political leaders who become dissatisfied with their figurehead, Joe Biden, who's barely walking for his entire term. And they say, okay, we have to swap this out. And they don't exercise total control. They can't do anything. There's lots of limits on their power and their decision making. But it's pretty clear that there is a system in place that is governing, and no one can be held accountable. And so the person who's at the front, whether it's Biden or Kamala Harris, is just a figurehead to be in the front of the system and to give a face for it, because we still have an institution called the chief executive, for better or for worse.
Okay, I'm going to open my third beer for this question, but what do you make of the QAnon movement intellectually? I'm fascinated by it. It's my strange, guilty pleasure to follow all these QAnon accounts on Twitter.
Okay.
And it's like a lot of these people are just convinced that JFK Jr. was going to parachute into the Republican National Convention and, you know, I don't know, become vice president or something. So there's like a lot of this crazy stuff. But then you look at other stuff that's actually crazy, like what happened in COVID, what happened with Trump's big executive order of 13848. I'm looking at it right here about sanctions to people who commit election fraud. And, you know, there's a lot of these people who say Trump is actually playing 4D chess and it's all under control. And I don't want to make too much of a gnosis of it or go down rabbit holes, but it is intellectually fascinating to me that a big percentage of Trump followers actually think there is this huge conspiracy that's about to dethrone the cabal, whatever you want to call it. Is that intellectually dangerous? I'm just kind of looking at it as an outside curious observer, but I think there might be something to it worth discussing.
I would say so. I think that mode of conspiracy theorizing is far too optimistic because it relies on the imagination that there is a man behind the curtain, that if you pull the curtain back, you can find the man and then you can swap him out and you can be saved and everything goes back to normal. And I think there's an incredible amount of optimism baked into that we actually can identify, the one person or the cabal of people who are responsible. And once we expose them, then everything will go back and we'll be safe. And there are conspiracies. This is just a function of human life and political society. There always are. Every deficient regime, every regime that doesn't act for the common good is by definition a conspiracy of people who are just securing their class interest or their family interest or their private interest. But there's a kind of unwarranted optimism in that mode of conspiracy theorizing, which holds out the false promise that we can fix everything if we just shed enough light on the situation. I think our problems go much deeper than that. I think there are very bad actors who work in conspiracies with one another to benefit themselves, and they wind up harming the rest of us. But I think there's that mode of conspiracy theorizing, I think, holds out a kind of false hope that if we just do enough burrowing into research, we'll expose them and then someone will save us. I think there's a lot of hard work we have to do in order to right the ship.
And isn't that exactly that's precisely what breeds the deification of somebody like Trump, is that everybody sort of identifies this guy as the one savior to tear down that curtain and blow up that system, which is dangerous in itself, right? Ryan, any thoughts on that? What do you think? What do you think about, you think JFK Jr. is still alive, Ryan?
I hadn't heard that one.
Oh, that's the big one.
Oh, yeah. See, I'm not up on QAnon.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts. You opened by talking about weird, and I think that's important. It is super weird. I think, yeah, just kind of two comments. One is with the deification. I think it's in is it the Capitol Rotunda? There's a ceiling mural of the apotheosis of George Washington. I mean, so we have this in our tradition, right?
Yep.
But I mean, looking at the current regime, looking at the current kind of dispensation of laws, institutions, attitudes, etc., like every regime has a god that kind of underpins it. And I think you can figure out what ours is, because if Trump is the antagonist, which I think it's clear he's the antagonist of the current regime, well, how do people within the regime, whether that's the actual institutions of government or the media or education, talk about him? He's literally Hitler. And
threat
so I
to
think,
democracy.
Yeah, and so I think that the story we've told about World War II and the kind of post-war settlement is the god. And so it's not actually a person, but it's this whole story about how America woke up and chose to defend freedom, and then we went on our glorious good crusade. Everyone was so happy and willing to do it. And then we beat the bad guys, and then we set up a good system. And it's like somehow that story coexists with the beginning of the Cold War, which we helped construct. So it's like kind of on its face a little crazy. But that's kind of the god, and it gets more extreme over time. The farther we get from World War II, the more we magnify like the person of Hitler, and like George W. Bush is literally Hitler, Mitt Romney's Hitler, Donald Trump is Hitler, and we just keep raising the stakes, which tells me that deification that we did in the post-war era is getting brittle because we keep having to insist on it, and it's gotten especially brittle. And this is the second thing I wanted to say, and it relates to QAnon and Blue Anon. I mean, these crazy.
What's Blue Anon?
That's the opposite. It's
No way.
Donald Trump actually staged the assassination attempt. And so somehow he convinced a 20-year-old to shoot his ear. And it's like, well, this 20-year-old is going to be a super accurate sniper job and shoot his ear
Maybe
and
he
then
just wanted the
die.
20-year-old to shoot a couple shots out in the crowd, but then he's got a little exploding movie pack behind his ear. That would make a lot more
You
sense.
could be the leader of Blue Anon, John.
I could be, yeah. Where do I apply?
But I think both Blue Anon and QAnon are symptomatic of. So not only is this kind of holy story that kind of lays the foundation for the current regime, not only is that getting stale and brittle, but the technology that it depended on is now obsolete. Broadcast television has been totally fractured by by cell phones, smartphones, and social media, and now deep fakes. I mean, consensus making technology has totally been shattered, and so things like QAnon are symptomatic of this, because all of a sudden the boomers are sharing these insane memes on Facebook because they don't have, a set of channels. Like, they grew up with 4 channels telling them, and all 4 anchors on all 4 channels said the same thing. Like, oh, 1960 offensive. The Vietnam War is now lost.
Yep.
And then everyone agreed. The Vietnam War is now lost. Draw down the troops. And it's like, it was really easy with that set of technology to create consensus. Now it's not so easy, and so people are going insane.
Yeah, they are. But then there's all this weird stuff that actually happens that kind of makes you go insane, like the whole Biden calling into Kamala's announcement, and then they just said this is obviously AI voice recording, right? Like, it was conclusively proven to be AI, or the fact that there were multiple shots, multiple guns at Trump's assassination. Like, but again, I don't know. I'm just seeing this online, like, conclusively proven to be AI. Well, somebody says so. What do I even make of that? But then I'm just looking at it and it looks really, really weird. So, I'm wondering, like, is it just more intellectually healthy for us to just kind of get out of there, take a break, get off the feeds, stop scrolling, kind of wait and see what happens, take care of your family, open up your diurnal every day and live a good life, try to vote the best way you can. Like, or is this even worth talking about? I mean, it's just kind of, we're in this weird place.
Yeah. And in a way, what you've just done, John, is make the case for a kind of apolitical withdrawal, and a compelling one, because of the insanities of the present and the media environment. And I'll just say, yeah, we do have to be really prudent about our use of technology, our use of social media, our obsession, and the ability to get sort of sucked into all kinds of rabbit holes. That said, the last thing you said about the option of sort of withdrawing, hope we vote, try to vote the right way. The difficulty is that at this juncture, and this is something I experienced, I don't think I would be able to think clearly about politics if I did not keep a finger on the pulse of Twitter or of non-traditional media sources. There is not some reliable, set of just these 3 networks that I could, or a couple of papers that I could pick up and read without looking at a screen, and get a sense of the landscape, so that I know whether to believe the propaganda or the hype for or against some candidate when it's time to vote in a primary, or even at the more state and local level. There's so much manipulation and propaganda being pumped through the system, I think, in a sign of desperation and brittleness, as Ryan was noting, that it's actually quite hard to simply tune into a radio station, read a paper, check a website, and get a good sense, because so many of those they're just all over the place. And so I think it's left to the citizen to sort through that. And unfortunately, that requires a kind of sacrifice of time and attention that part of me would really love to put somewhere else, in just spending time with my family and just touching grass in just reading great books. But as a result of what I see as my civic duty, I feel I have to stay informed. And I think it's in our day and age that requires a certain immersion in the digital and a certain attention to the variety of perspectives that are out there, so that I can sort through and make prudent judgments about voting when it's time to vote, about political action when it's time to take that, as a way of ultimately serving my family and my local community. And
thank you for
church.
saying that. And now next time my wife accuses me of staring at my phone for way too long, I can just say, babe, I'm doing my civic duty, and I'm doing it. I'm doing it for you. I'm doing it for you.
Don't tell her I sanctioned that. But yeah, go ahead.
To connect it to education, I think, political action. What does this even mean? It sounds very abstract, like voting. Yeah, sure. I guess you get called to jury duty too. But another one is schools, like governing a school, and because schools exist in the context, right? And so in Oregon, really everywhere, but I mean, this is where I am, there's all sorts of pressures on Catholic schools, on Christian schools. Like, you need to be ready to, from the point of the state government, you need to be ready to affirm all sorts of lifestyle choices that contradict the faith.
Yep.
And so if your administration and even your teachers and even your parent, like the body of parents, is not ready to kind of stand up straight in the time of testing, there's going to be a problem. And so in order to do that, in order to be ready for that challenge, you need to be aware that it's coming. And so I'm very thankful, for example, here in the Archdiocese of Portland, is our Archbishop has been very proactive, publishing guidelines about human sexuality and how it relates to schools, and what to do about students. You need to think through all this, because if you don't, it's going to come at you suddenly, and you're probably, if you're a, like, kind-souled, sympathetic person, you're going to make a horrible decision. And it's going to backfire terribly. And so I've just heard all these stories about churches and schools that are, they're trying to uphold biblical teaching, church teaching, but they're trying to, be pastoral and care about the person in front of them. And they get themselves in this wild tangle because in the moment, it's really hard to think clearly about, will you baptize my kid? Can my kid socially transition at your school? Et cetera, et cetera. It's much easier to think clearly about those questions before you're on the spot being accused of being a bigot. So that's political action. And if your school has not done that, you need to do it right now. You need it, like administrators, teachers, parents need to sit down and start thinking about this. Another one would be like advocating for school choice. Can we mobilize our school around getting this stuff on the ballot? Will that make our school too political? Oh my gosh, this is very scary.
Yeah, so that's kind of the takeaway from this conversation is education requires one to take a side, right? And then we all look and say, well, what side? Whose camp? Whose team? I got to be on Redimer's team. He's a Protestant. I guess. But I think that's why your initiative of Agoge is doing something very, very good. It's like you said, planting a flag, saying, here we are, let's get together. We'll work it out. We're not going to agree on everything, but it's a place to come and have these discussions.
Yes.
Which is needed. And it's not even providing a service like AMI is, like, we'll educate you, or others that have a service. You're just a square of ideas with alignment on certain first principles. Yeah. That's, do you want money? Like, what do you want? Like, you're not even asking for donations. Are you a C3? I mean, how do you guys sustain yourselves?
You could send the check directly to me, John.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I'll take care of it.
No, yeah, we're really just a signal chat and a website and a bunch of people who like reading and writing.
And right, as I said before, we write about these things, we answer our emails, we want to talk. I don't do this, but some of the members of our group who actually work in the K-12 classical movement, they're attending all of those conferences that are for classical educators and their presence there. And so we're really a network and a fellowship. And gosh, what do we need in this time? We need groups of like-minded people to come together and work for the common good on relevant issues. And the tendency of our regime is to isolate us so that we're easier to manage and to make sure everything conforms to its first principles. And so we're creating an independent group where we can strengthen our resolve, sharpen our ideas, exchange ideas, talk, write together so that we can teach and run our schools more effectively.
I mean, one really easy action thing is on this statement, education is always political, on the agogayclassical.org website, is we just took signatures. People just is because it's kind of open letter, like come sign on to this very simple statement that we internally fought over a lot, did lots of edits and revisions, and so we got it nice and polished, just how we wanted it. And so then we sent it to a bunch of people when we announced and said, do you want to sign? Do you want to affirm this? And so a bunch of people did. And that form is still open. We'd love signatures from your listeners. And we got all sorts of people. Kevin Roberts from Heritage Foundation, Rusty Reno from First Things, David Goodwin from ACCS, Ben Merkel from New St. Andrews, Chris Rufo, Jeremy Tate. So all these people. So yeah, John, love to have your listeners sign on and just say like, yeah, these guys, I agree with what these guys are saying. This is something that needs to happen in education.
Let's do it. I already signed, and you should too. gogayclassical.org. And AMI is a friend of yours, and we're grateful for your friendship as well. Thank you guys for doing what you're doing. I know it's inglorious and not lucrative at all. And that's the beauty of all this, is that, like you said, the thumos, right? You're doing something worthy in itself. You're willing to die for it. We'll see, maybe. I mean, so far you've just published a blog for it, but yeah, good first step. So gogayclassical.org. Anything else you guys want to say on your way out here? This has been great. I don't want to take all your time, but thank you for sharing 3 beers with me.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm almost done with my whiskers on kittens. I just think the last thing I'll say is just some recommended reading once people have exhausted everything on our website. I really, really love T.S. Eliot's essay, Modern Education and the Classics, which will kind of give some insight into some of what we're saying. But I just thought of it, John, because you mentioned you have to stand for something. And that's the point Eliot makes in this essay, is he contrasts 3 camps. And I would expand the picture a little bit, but the picture is very good. There's the radicals on one side, the orthodox on the other side where he stands, and in the middle is just kind of the mushy liberals. And the mushy liberals, these are the people who want to take the thumos out of education. And he says about the radicals, like basically communists, like they know that education is good for making Bolsheviks.
Yep.
And they want to use education to make more Bolsheviks.
Yep.
Catholics, and he's using it in a kind of generic sense of like Orthodox Christians. Catholics need to do the same thing. Like education is for making Catholics in this sense. We can't do the liberal thing where education is just kind of, oh yeah, whatever.
And even propedeutic to this sort of education itself, they know, that is, the radicals know the power that Plato knew and that Aristotle knew, that is the power of gymnastic and of poesis, because they use the heck out of media, songs, passions. Before thumos, there's eros, right? And so the key to the thumotic direction, the key to the thumotic rudder is the erotic. And they've been getting at the erotic way better than we have. And so really controlling the direction of the population. And you could, that's why the sexual revolution is so important, because if you can be owned at the level of eros, that you could be controlled really, really easily. We don't do things beautifully. We don't do things excellently, we make these like movies that you should go see because they were made by a really good cause, but they suck. We've lost the arts, we've lost the gymnasium, and without that, you can't be educated. And they know that, and they've been educating really, really well. They don't produce naturally, but they've been producing quite a bit in the classrooms because of our negligence.
Closing note on that note, po kalon, right? The beautiful, the noble, that Greek term has that kind of aesthetic excellence and moral excellence are both denoted by that same term in Plato and in Aristotle. And there is a connection there of what's going to draw you out of yourself towards the physically beautiful and also towards the morally beautiful, or just the technically excellent and someone accomplishing a task very, very well. A last recommended reading is just pick up Plutarch's Life of Pericles and read the first couple of paragraphs. Plutarch there describes why he writes lives of noble men, what he's doing, and what he's describing there is the experience, the salutary experience of spending your time thinking about virtuous examples, and not just the analysis, which I love, the sort of philosophical analysis of virtue and vice, but the embodiment, the portraits, the actual particulars of men who are striving for virtue or attempting and failing, and just putting that in front of you can have the effect on your own moral disposition as habituating yourself to beautiful music or beautiful art. That's fundamentally what classical education ought to be doing, and it shouldn't shrink from that task of saying there are some people who are virtuous and some who are vicious, and there are some who are noble and some who are base, and there are some who really manifest greatness of soul and others who fall far, far short of that standard. And we want to spend our years, especially with younger students in classical schools, habituating them to see the noble as noble, and see the glorious as glorious, and see the contemptible as contemptible, and to do so in accordance with a true and natural and ultimately divine standard, and not the distorted standards of contemporary ideology.
Well said. And that sort of habituation to the palatability of the kalos, the beautiful, the fine, the noble, takes effort, especially late in life. It takes less effort when you're a kid, but like any cultivation of any good habit, you got to work at it, which is why it's so critically important that you know, at risk of not doing your civic duty and putting down the Twitter feed, get on a Go-Gay, read a few things, listen to beautiful music when it's harder to do so, and you'd rather listen to pop, eat some great dark chocolate when it's easier to eat Hershey's. It's going to be painful at first. It's going to be painful at first, but that's
lift.
That's
it's
right.
Huge.
That's how habits are cultivated, right?
That's
is
right.
work. And so that's why your work is so important. With that, I'm going to make a quick shameless plug for AMI's cohort program opening soon. Enrollment is almost full, but Larissa wanted me to remind you that you can still register for the cohort. This is what many of our fellows have been demanding, is that we do a 3-year systematic study through the liberal arts core curriculum with the same people. So it's $50 a month. It's one thing we do that isn't free because we got to have some commitment, some skin in the game, and pay our teachers. Hopefully, Pavlos, you'll be one of them. And hopefully, Ryan, you can come and teach some language courses. We have, by the way, a lot of demand for language as of late, and we just did classical Greek and Latin with Stephen Courtwright, but I know we want to do a lot more of that. So anyway, the cohort at magnusinstitute.org, $50 a month, best money you'll ever spend. It's one class a week for a couple hours in the same group of students that you'll get to know as friends over a 3-year period, and then culminate in a in-person event. So very excited to announce that endeavor at Albertus Magnus Institute, and a few others on the way that we can announce shortly. That's the plug. So magnusinstitute.org. Pavlos Papadopoulos, Ryan Hammill, you guys really made my day. Thank you for drinking 3 beers with me. This was great, and God bless the work of a Go-Gay at agogayclassical.org. A Go-Gay, and get yourself some politically minded classical education. That's a terrible pitch, but hey.
You did great.
Beautiful.
Thanks for having us.
All right,
Thank you
guys.
so much, John. Great to see you.
Awesome work. Peace out.